Hi, welcome to Unsightly Opinions. If you're new, my name's Tamara, and today we're going to explore a number of different sewing concepts. If you're here just for the tutorial on sewing a Victorian-inspired apron, you can skip to the timestamp listed on screen right now or linked right down below in the description box. Before we get into the tutorial, I want to give you a little bit of a tour and tell you why I got into sewing. I have been a professional seamstress for about 10 years. I'm going to pop some examples of things I've sewn up on screen right now. Sewing is not something that I think I would have naturally gotten into, but it's something that I felt driven to try because I was told I couldn't. When we started home ec in junior high school, I was told I was not going to be able to use the sewing machine, I was not going to be allowed to sew, and I certainly wouldn't be touching a serger. That made me angry because every other student was allowed to do so. I have a bit of a streak when somebody tells me I can't do something because I'm blind that I become twice as determined to prove them wrong. So that night I went home, I pulled my mom's sewing machine off the shelf and I made her teach me how to thread it and I made her teach me how to sew. And today I'm going to teach you what I learned. First, let's do a little tour of my sewing room. I come in here to decompress, to unwind, to enjoy, to create, and I love this space. The first rule in this space is it has to be organized. Because I can't see colors and because I want to be as independent in this space as possible, organization is imperative. Every single item in this space has a home. All of the colors on this sewing wall have braille labels. So I know exactly which color tones I'm in, and then if I need to find a more specific color within that tone, I'll call somebody on Be My Eyes so they can tell me, does this specific thread match with the fabric that I have? Everything inside my drawers has a home, from sewing parts to glue guns to sewing scissors to all my notions. Everything has a specific spot, so I can access it really quickly. All of my ribbons, all of my zippers, all of my finishing things like old pieces of jewelry that I might sew onto a costume have a home and are labeled accordingly. Now I'm going to show you why I use this machine versus many others that are on the market. I picked this sewing machine in particular because it has buttons. I can't tell you how annoying it is when you go and you try and sew something and you just have a giant touch screen. That is so frustrating for me because I can't read the screen, I can't hit all the buttons. So I picked this machine specifically because it had buttons and because I could key in the different stitches and I could just memorize which ones I wanted. The second reason I got this machine is because it has a lever for your thigh that raises and lowers the presser foot. Because my hands are my eyes when I'm sewing, I need to use both hands to get my fabric straight and get everything oriented. So I can't be using my hand to flick up and down the presser foot lever. The third thing is this machine and most newer machines have auto threaders. It is the most magical thing on the planet. This is what makes this machine completely accessible to me. I press a button, my needle gets threaded, I don't have to worry about a thing. The next question you're probably asking is, how do I measure things? The short answer is with a regular old measuring tape. This one's from the dollar store. The only difference to this measuring tape from your average measuring tape is every single inch has a notch cut out of it. So I can run my hands along and feel those notches, and then every half inch I have a dot poked through this measuring tape, just with a pin. That took somebody who was sighted about 2 minutes, and now I can use this measuring tape for years and years and years without any trouble. I know that there are large print measuring tapes if that's something that's more useful to you, and high contrast measuring tapes, but the standard accessible blind measuring tape that has staples in it is really difficult to use because the staples aren't necessarily put in straight, but because those staples catch on the fabric, especially if you're dealing with really thin fabrics like chiffons and organzas. Just to save my eyes today, because this room is lit up like a Christmas tree, and to show you that I don't use my vision for sewing at all, even though it looks like I'm looking at things a lot of the time, I'm going to put on a blindfold. So from conceptualization to execution, I'm going to be wearing a blindfold the entire time. Alright, I've got my blindfold on. I am much more comfortable now because it is way too bright in this room. So what I do when I conceptualize or when I'm drawing is I will usually go to my Sewell Raised Line drawing kit. This is magical. Normally I use the pen that comes with it that has no ink, but what this is a rubberized board with a plastic sheet on top that you can use any ballpoint pen on, and the moment you touch it to the paper, it's going to create a raised line instantly. I can design and draw and think about what kind of pieces I'm going to need for my pattern and what I'm going to be doing. I don't have a pattern for an apron, so I am going to draft one myself. I'm gonna draw what I think this is going to look like. The bodice section is going to be a trapezoid shape, like so. Then the skirt section, or the lower part, I want it to have a bit of a flare. Because I know most Victorian ladies wore very full dresses, I want it to have that triangular feel to it. So that's just going to be another trapezoid shape going the other direction. I really like the idea of a waistband. I think those are really pretty. I like them in dresses, so I'm going to insert one into my design. And then I'm going to, from that waistband, add a loop at the back. And then I want really long straps that zigzag in the back. So this is what my design looks like right now. There are two things in this design that I'm not sure what I'm going to want yet. I may or may not add a little bit of a gather to the waist just to give it a little more body in the skirt, and I may also add a large pocket in the front. Possibly with a button, possibly not. We're just gonna kind of do it organically. This is how I like to create. I like to cut my pieces and feel how they work and then go from there. Once I have my general design made, what I'm going to decide is what the dimensions are for each piece. I know the bodice piece is going to be a trapezoid shape, upside down trapezoid. The skirt is probably, if it's not gathered, going to be trapezoidal again. It's just going to determine how much of that waist we're going to have and how much we're going to gather it in. So again, that's going to be another trapezoid shape, and that's going to be our largest piece, so that's the one I want to figure out first. And then we have two very long straps, and then we have our waistband, which we're going to turn into a loop on the side, and then we have our optional pocket. So this is kind of what I've drafted. So we have the waistband here, we have the pocket here, this is the skirt here, this is the bodice here, and then we have the two very long skinny straps. So these are the pieces we're going to need. I'm going to tell you the dimensions of these as we're doing them. I'm going to be going off of my measurements today, but I'll tell you how to do them if you want to copy this for yourself. We have changed locations. We are now at my kitchen table just because I needed more space to lay out my fabric. So what we're doing is we're actually drafting our pattern right on the fabric we're using. I have two 1-yard cuts of 58-inch wide cotton. I'm going to double up most of my pieces because I found this cotton to be very, very thin. The other thing that I did is I gave it a really quick iron because it was super wrinkled when I got it. The two big pieces I am worried about are the long strips for the ties and the skirt. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this long side of my fabric, this 58 inches, and I am going to turn that into the two straps for the side. So if I want a 2-inch strap, I have to cut out double that width plus an inch. So I need to cut out 5 inches. I need to give myself twice the width because we're going to be folding each piece in half plus the seam allowance. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start at one end and I am going to measure 5 inches with pins every couple of inches. I have drafted with chalk. I find I can't feel it 100% of the time, so usually I will draft with pins. And I don't pin in the standard direction most seamstresses pin. I pin in the direction that I am going to be cutting.
I placed pins at the 5-inch mark every couple of inches along the entire length of my fabric to make the straps. When done pinning, I went back to check and make sure that the pins were exactly at 5 inches and adjusted as necessary.
Now that I have that piece, the next piece I'm going to worry about is the skirt. So I'm going to give myself essentially this entire right half of my fabric for sewing the skirt, and we're going to draft that last. Over on this side, we're going to be doing the waistband, which I want going the same direction because even though cotton doesn't have a nap, I can still feel the textural difference in the weave. So I'm going to pretend that it does. The next piece I'm going to draft is the bodice piece. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come along and measure kind of from the meat of my pectoral muscles, either side, which is kind of where I want the outside top of my apron to sit. 12 inches. We're aiming for the 12 inches across at the top here. We're going to give ourselves a 2-inch seam allowance on either side, and that's just because I really like the look of the wide lined top stitch in the old Victorian style. And that's going to give us a little extra bulk on the sides just to make it lay flat really nicely when we iron it. So if it's 12 inches, we're going to need 16 inches across.
I marked the 16 inches along the top of the bodice with pins. I needed a 12-inch long bodice, so I marked 14.5 inches vertically, allowing a 2-inch seam at the top and a half-inch seam at the bottom. For a 10-inch waist, I added the 2 inches of seam allowance on either side and marked the 14-inch line, 14.5 inches down from the 16-inch line at the top. I then used a plastic protractor to mark the side angles and pinned the complete trapezoid shape.
So now what we're going to need to do is draft the waist strip. This is the strip that we're going to attach loops to that our crisscross straps in the back are going to cross over through. And it's also going to give us a place that we can hang a tea towel or fold something over if we want to.
To create the rectangular waistband piece, I measured out and pinned the 10 inches for the waist and added 4.5 inches on either side for the loops, making a 19-inch long strip with a 5-inch width, the same as our straps.
So let's cut out these pieces and then we're going to play with our skirt. Right now, I'm just going to cut it out as a rectangle, and once we get our bodice together, I'm going to get a better feel for if I want that gathering at the waist or not. Then we're going to shape our skirt panel.
I used my hand to help me stay straight as I worked my way around the pieces following the pins. I did draft and cut out a pocket, but I didn't end up liking it on the apron stylistically, so I cut all of that footage. Then I decided to not be a coward and cut out the trapezoidal skirt piece. I folded my fabric in half and cut a slight angle along the raw edge using my measuring tape as a line guide. Next, I set up my iron and took my 2 long straps and my waistband, folded them in half, then pressed them along the fold so they stayed flat when I sewed them. Then I ironed my 2 bodice pieces, folding and pressing in the 2-inch seams using my measuring tape as a guide on the top and 2 sides. I did the same thing on the skirt layers, pressing the same 2-inch seams into the sides and bottom. Ironing gives me a tactile line I can follow when I'm on my sewing machine so my seams stay more straight.
So the next step here is I'm going to take my waistband and my 2 straps and I'm going to sew along the outside edge here at a 5/8 seam. Now on my machine, it's really great. I've done this because this was something I did when I first started sewing. This is a continuation, this line here, of the edge of my presser foot. It's just masking tape or painter's tape. I usually have white electrical tape because it matches my machine, but it helps me keep my fabric straight. Even when it's back here on the machine, I can use one hand to guide and make sure that it's going in straight so it doesn't get all janky. So first, I just kind of put it under the presser foot, I press my needle down button, and then we're ready to rock and roll. So I do a few stitches forward, and then I do a few stitches backwards.
I continued to sew along the waistband, sewing my raw edges together at 5/8 of an inch. Then I repeated the exact same process with my 2 long straps at 5/8 of an inch. Next, I worked on the bodice, sewing my 2 layers together. I stitched both sides following my ironed line, leaving the top and bottom open. Then I went back to my straps, finishing one end on each strap by sewing a curve. You could sew a straight line, I just like angled strap ends. Then I added notches, or little triangular cuts, to the fabric inside my seam, so when it's turned right way out, the fabric sits more flat. I prefer my embroidery scissors for cutting notches, as the scissor blades are much smaller and easier to control. Then I turned my straps right way out by feeding the fabric into itself and pulling it through. Normally I'd use a coat hanger or something else to help push the fabric through, but I couldn't find one, so I did it by hand.
Alright, so now we have one turned out strap. I'm going to do the other one off camera because that took a long time, and then we'll be back to continue.
Next, I inserted the 2 straps along the outside seams of the bodice between the 2 bodice layers like a sandwich and lined up the raw edges of the strap with the top of the bodice pieces. Then I sewed them in place. Then I stitched along the entire top of the bodice to seal it closed.
Now we're going to turn it right ways out after we cut out these corners, because otherwise it won't be flat. Then we should have a really nice looking bodice that's all the way finished.
Anytime a seam turns a corner, I always cut out the excess fabric to make sure it lays flat on the inside.
So now that we have this here, we can go back and we can iron this flat, but I'm actually going to get the skirt together before we do that. So, on to the skirt, our next step.
Just like with the bodice, I was following the lines I had ironed into it, attaching the bottoms and sides together, leaving the top open. I was on the 3rd side when all of a sudden the sewing machine gremlins decided to attack. Let's look at this one more time in slow motion to see exactly what happened with my needle, and emphasize my stunning facial features. Once I regained my composure and replaced my needle, I finished off the last side of the skirt, cut the excess fabric at the corners, turned it right ways out, and added a gathering stitch to the top side of the skirt. I then pulled the bobbin thread to gather the skirt so it was the same width as the bottom of my bodice. Next, I folded the bottom of the bodice in on itself to create a finished edge and inserted the skirt into the bodice like a pita pocket, pinning, then stitching it in place. Nearly there now. I finished the two ends of my waistband, then turned it right ways out, keeping the seam to the back. I then took my finished waistband and centered it on the bodice at the waist and folded the bands over at the ends to create two loops. I attached the outside edge of the loops to the bodice. Then as a final step, I went around the entire outside of the apron and top stitched at 2 inches.
We've done it! We've sewn a Victorian-inspired apron, and I've done it without my eyes. I'm going to give this one more iron because I'm sure that you're sick of seeing me ironing at this point, and then we'll do a grand reveal. See you in a moment. Here you have it, a completed Victorian apron. I think it turned out really well. Next time I might bring in the sides a little bit. It had a little bit too much of a flare in the skirt, I think, and the angles were a little too sharp. So if you ended up just gathering a straight rectangle, that would still turn out really nicely. All in all, I think I'm going to wear this in the kitchen a lot, and I have an easy Halloween costume. If you enjoy content like this, please consider liking and subscribing. Leave me a comment if you have any questions. If I wasn't clear as to what I was doing in a specific part of the video, I'd be happy to explain further. If you want to keep up with me between uploads, I have an accessible Twitch stream every Tuesday and Sunday nights at 7:30 Mountain Standard Time, linked on screen and in the description. And I have my other social media linked in the description box down below. I'll see y'all next time. Bye for now.